If, then, we try to describe by means of a symbol what pressure of time prevents our discussing adequately today, we may say, taking the moon, contrasted with the sun, as the symbol representing the Yahweh religion, we may expect that a similar form of belief, bypassing, as it were, the Christ impulse, would emerge later on as a kind of moon religion. And this is what actually happened. The old Yahweh religion emerged again after the Christ event in the religion of the crescent, carrying earlier impulses into post-Christian times. If you do not take things superficially, the use of the moon and crescent as symbols for these two faiths will not be something to smile at, for it is an actual fact that a religion or creed and its symbol are intimately connected. So in the later time we have the repetition of an earlier phase which has skipped the intervening years. This takes place in the last third of the Greco-Latin epoch, which in the occult sense we reckon as lasting up to the 12th and into the 13th century. Leaving out a period of 600 years, this means that beginning in the 6th century AD and exercising a very vigorous influence upon all aspects of development, we have the religion brought by the Arabians from Africa over into Spain. This represents a re-emergence, in a different form, of the Yahweh moon religion. The intervening Christ impulse has been ignored. It is not possible to enumerate all the characteristics brought over with the religion of Muhammad, but it is important to realize that the Christ impulse is disregarded in the religion of Islam, which was actually a kind of revival of Mosaic monotheism. This idea of the one God, however, included a good deal derived from other sources, for instance from Egypto-Chaldean religion, which has yielded very exact knowledge of the connection of happenings in the starry heavens with earthly events. Thus the thoughts and ideas current among the Egyptians, Chaldeans, Babylonians, and Assyrians appear again in the religion of Muhammad, but pervaded by the one God, Yahweh. Speaking scientifically, what we have in Arabism is a kind of gathering together, a synthesis of the wisdom teachings of the priests of Egypt and Chaldea and the Yahweh religion of the ancient Hebrews. In such a process, there is not only compression, but also rejection and elimination. In this case, everything connected with clairvoyant perception had to be discarded, and men were to depend entirely upon reason and intellectual thinking. Hence the concepts belonging to the Egyptian art of healing and to Chaldean astronomy, which in both these peoples were the outcome of clairvoyance, are to be found in the Arabism of Muhammad in an intellectualized and individualized form. Something that had passed, as it were, through a filter, was thus brought into Europe by the Arabians. Old concepts that had been current among the Egyptians and Chaldeans were denuded of their visionary pictorial content and recast into abstract forms. They reappear in the wonderful scientific knowledge possessed by the Arabians, who made their way into Europe via Africa and Spain. Whereas Christianity brought an impulse connected essentially with man's life of soul, the greatest impulse given to the human intellect was brought by the Arabians. Without thorough knowledge of the course taken by the evolution of humanity, it is impossible to form any idea of how much the world conception, which arose in a new form under the symbol of the moon, has given to mankind. There could have been no Kepler, no Galileo, without the impulses brought by Arabism into Europe. For the old mode of thinking appears again, but now denuded of its ancient clairvoyance, when the third culture epoch celebrated its resurrection in our own fifth epoch, in our modern astronomy, in our modern science. Thus the course of evolution is such that, on the one hand, the Christ impulse penetrates into the European peoples directly, through Greece and Italy. And on the other hand, a more southerly stream bypasses Greece and Italy, and unites with the influences brought indirectly by the Arabians. Only through the union of Christianity and Mohammedanism during the important period with which we are dealing, was it possible for our modern culture to come into being. For reasons which I cannot go into today, we have to reckon with periods of 6 to 6.5 centuries for such impulses as I have been describing. Thus, actually 6 centuries after the Christ event, the renewed moon cult of the Arabians appears, expanding and spreading into Europe, and until the 13th century, enriching the Christian culture which had received its direct impulses by other paths. There was an unbroken interchange of thought. If you are conversant merely with the outer course of events, if you know how in the monasteries of Western Europe, in spite of apparent opposition to Arabism, the Arabian concepts made their way into science, you will also be aware that until the middle of the 13th century, again a particularly significant point of time, the Arabian impulse and the direct Christ impulse were interwoven. From this you will gather that the direct Christ impulse actually moved along paths different from those taken by the impulses which streamed in like tributaries to unite with it. 6 centuries after the Christ event, as a result of happenings that are not easy to characterize, although they are well known to every occultist, a new wave of culture arose in the East, made its way via Africa and Spain into the spiritual life of Europe, and united with the Christ impulse, which had taken different paths. We can therefore say that the sun and moon symbols merged into each other from the 6th, 7th century up to the 12th, 13th century, again a period of some 600 years. After this process of cross-fertilization had in a certain respect achieved its goal, something new arose, which had been in preparation since about the 12th or 13th century. It is interesting that today even orthodox science recognizes that something inexplicable passed through the souls of Europeans at that time. Science considers it inexplicable, but occultism knows that in this period, as though it were following the Christ impulse, something yielded by the 4th post-Atlantean epoch poured spiritually into the souls of men. The fruits of Greek culture constituted a following wave. We call this period the Renaissance. It was the culture which, during the next centuries, enriched everything already in existence. Here, again, there was an overlapping, after a period of 600 years since the influx of Arabism. At this point in evolution, the age of Greece, which was a kind of center among the 7 post-Atlantean epochs, underwent a certain renewal in the Renaissance. Then, again, there is a period of 600 years, during which the Greek wave reaches its culmination. This brings us to the period in which we ourselves are living. We are living today at the beginning of a period of transition before the onset of the next 600-year wave of culture, when something entirely new is pressing in upon us, when the Christ impulse is to be enriched by something new. After the moon culture underwent its revival in the religion symbolized by the crescent, and had reached its conclusion during the period of the Renaissance, the time has now come when the Christ impulse must receive into itself another tributary stream. With this tributary stream, our own age has a particular affinity. But we must clearly understand what the influx of this new stream means to our own culture. All these happenings are entirely in accordance with an occult plan. We could also say an occult purpose. If we think of Moon, Mercury, Venus, Sun in the old, not the new sequence, we should expect, after the renewal of the moon influence had reached its culmination during the Renaissance, the influx of another stream, to which we could legitimately assign the symbol of Mercury. If our symbolism is correct, just as we called the wave of Arabism a moon culture, so we might say theoretically that we now face the prospect of an influx of a form of Mercury culture. If we understand the way in which culture and civilization have developed, we may justifiably name Goethe as the last great individual to combine in his soul the full fruits of science, parenthesis, that is to say, intellectualism enriched by Arabism, close parenthesis, of Christianity and of Renaissance culture. We should therefore expect him to represent a glorious union of the three domains. And having studied Goethe as we have been doing for years, we can easily recognize that these elements do indeed flow together in his soul. But after what has been said about the cycles of 600 years, we should not expect to find in Goethe any trace of the Mercury influence. We should expect it to appear as something new only after his time. And here it is interesting to note that Goethe's pupil, Schopenhauer, already reveals signs of this new influence. I have said that Schopenhauer's philosophy contains elements of Eastern wisdom, particularly in the form of Buddhism. Mercury has always been regarded as the symbol of Buddhism. So, after the age of Goethe, there was a revival of the Buddha influence, Buddha standing for Mercury and Mercury for Buddha, in the same way as the moon influence reappeared in Arabism. This side stream, which flowed into the direct Christ impulse at the beginning of a new 600-year period, can therefore be described, within the limits indicated in my public lecture on the subject, as a revival of Buddhism. We can now ask, which is the stream of culture that flows straight forward into the future? It is the Christ stream. And what side streams are there? Firstly, there is the Arabian stream, which flows into the main current, then has a pause, and finally passes into the culture of the Renaissance. At the present time, a renewed influx of the Buddha stream is taking place. If we are able to see these things in the right light, it will become evident that we have to absorb those elements of the Buddha stream which were not hitherto present in Western culture. And we can see how certain elements of the Buddha stream are actually making their way into the spiritual development of the West, for instance, the teaching of reincarnation and karma. But there is something else that we must impress firmly upon our minds, and it is this: none of these side streams will ever be able to throw light on the central fact of our world conception, of our spiritual science. To expect from Buddhism or any other pre-Christian Oriental religion undergoing revival in our time any illumination on the nature of Christ would be no more intelligent than for European Christians to have expected this of the Arabians who had spread into Spain. The people of Europe at that time knew very well that the Christ idea was foreign to the Arabians, that the Arabians could say nothing essential about the Christ. And when they did say anything, the ideas put forward were incompatible with the true Christ idea. The various prophets down to Sabbatai Zewi, footnote Sabbatai Zewi, Z-E-W-I, from 1626 to 1676, proclaimed himself publicly in the year 1666 as the Messiah, but subsequently became an adherent of Islam. End of footnote. Let me read that sentence again. The various prophets, down to Sabbatai Zewi, who appeared as false messiahs without any understanding whatever of the Christ impulse, all sprang from Arabism. Obviously, therefore, the contributions of this Arabian side stream consisted of quite different elements. It could shed no light on the central mystery of the Christ. Our attitude to the stream that is approaching today as a side current must be the same. It is a revival of an older stream and will promote understanding of reincarnation and karma, but cannot possibly bring any elucidation of the Christ impulse. That would be as absurd as if the Arabians, although they were able to bring to Europeans many ideas through false messiahs up to the time of Sabbatai Zewi, had set about giving Europe a true idea of Christ. Such occurrences will be repeated, for the evolution of mankind can go forward only if men are strong enough to see through these things with greater and greater clarity. What we shall find is that the spiritual science, founded by European Rosicrucianism, with Christ as its central idea, will establish itself despite external obstacles and penetrate into the hearts of men in defiance of all temptations from outside. From my book Occult Science, you can gather how the central Christ idea must penetrate into human souls, how the Christ is interwoven with the evolution not only of humanity, but of the whole world. And you will be able to recognize along which path progress will be made. The possibility of following this onward march of spiritual science will be within reach of everyone who understands the words from the Gospel of St. Mark, quoted at the end of the last lecture, quote, "False Christs and false prophets will appear. When men say to you, 'Lo, here is the Christ,' 'Lo, there,' believe them not." Close quote. But beside this stream, there is another, claiming to be better informed than Western Rosicrucian spiritual science about the nature of Christ. This other stream will introduce all kinds of ideas and dogmas which will develop quite naturally out of the side stream of Oriental Buddhism. But Western souls would be showing the worst kind of feebleness if they fail to understand that the Buddha, or Mercury stream, has as little light to throw on the direct development of the Christ idea as Arabism had in its time. What I am saying now is not the outcome of any special belief, dogma, or fantasy. It emerges from the objective course of world evolution. If you wanted to follow this up, I could prove by figures or by the trends of culture that things will inevitably be as occult science teaches. But in connection with all this, a distinction must be made. On the one hand, there is orthodox Oriental Buddhism in its original form. The attempt might be made to transplant this as a fixed and unalterable system into Europe, and to produce out of it an idea, a conception of Christ. On the other hand, there is Buddhism that has progressed to further stages of development. There will be people who will tell you to think of the Buddha just as he was some 500 or 600 years before our era, and of the doctrines he then promulgated. But compare this with what Rosicrucian spiritual science has to say. It will say, the fault lies with you, not with the Buddha, that you talk as if Buddha had come to a standstill at the point he had attained all those centuries ago. Do you imagine that Buddha has not progressed? When you speak as you do, you are speaking of teaching that was right for his epoch. But we look to the Buddha who has moved onward, and from spiritual realms exercises an enduring influence upon human culture. We contemplate the Buddha as described in our studies of St. Luke's Gospel, whose influence streamed down upon the Jesus of the Nathan line of the house of David. We contemplate the Buddha at the further stage of his development, in the realm of the Spirit, who proclaims from there the truths of basic importance for our time. Something strange has happened in dogmatic Christianity in the West. By a curious concatenation of circumstances, a Buddha-like figure has appeared among the Christian saints. You will remember that I once spoke of a legend current all over Europe in the Middle Ages, namely the legend of Balaam and Josaphat. Its content was more or less as follows. There was once an Indian king who had a son. In his early years, far removed from all human misery and life in the outer world, the son was brought up in the royal palace, where he saw only conditions making for human happiness and well-being. Josaphat was his name, though it has been frequently changed.